If you're a 90s kid, like me, you might remember the TV show Jackie Chan Adventures. It's kind of deep lore, ancient magic, but it's a cartoon aired on Kids WB, featured Jackie Chan, the great karate action hero. There's a cartoon version, and he would go out and he would fight the bad guys, but he had this mentor who was this old man. I think it was his uncle, but kind of a Mr. Miyagi figure. He would give him sage advice or pointers about where to go and what to do. And right as Jackie was about to run out the door and beat the bad guys, the old man would pop back up into the screen and hold up his finger and say, "One more thing." And that is how I feel after Tuesday's episode about psychology, souls, angels, and demons. I feel like I have one more thing to tell you about this. So let's get into it. Okay, I am going to get back to words, and our series on translating untranslatable words and concepts. But while it's still fresh in our minds, I wanted to say one more thing about this whole set of issues that I raised on Tuesday regarding demons and psychology and the relationship between therapy speak versus soul speak, and not just the movie Inside Out, but that this whole kind of parcel of issues, are demons real? Because as you probably know by now on this show, on Tuesdays we wear pink, and on Fridays we talk about language. And it occurred to me as I was watching people discuss that Tuesday episode, which generated a lot of interesting feedback. I was getting in the conversation with you guys, and it occurred to me that this issue of whether demons exist in any real sense is kind of an issue of language, and it reveals some of the properties of language that I've been trying to drive home as we talk about translation and some of the more mysterious elements of what language really is, not just the words we say, but what it represents as a function of, I would say, our souls. That I think our souls really are, in some sense, defined by their production of language and their understanding of the world in linguistic terms, using words in the broadest possible sense and concepts to organize our experience of reality. And I think that this issue of whether demons are real and the transition that we've made from generally most people thinking that demons are real into, in the modern era, most people not really believing in demons, represents a way in which a shift in the language we use can be the catalyst for, or the indicator of, a really profound transformation in the way that we see the world and the things that we're able to see and not able to see. I started out on that episode by pointing out that our underlying experience of emotions, like the ones that are depicted in the movie Inside Out, fear, joy, sadness, that underlying experience hasn't changed over the thousands of years that Western civilization has been going on. All the even words that we use, like joy and sadness and anger, these would have analogs in Greek, and it would be interesting to compare how the Greek ones slightly differ from the English ones, but underlying those words, I think we could all safely say that the set of experiences, emotional experiences that we have of the world has remained the same. But our language for explaining what's going on underneath those experiences or causing those experiences, that language has radically changed. We say now that we're suffering depression rather than desolation, which would be a more spiritual term. We say that we have disorders, but we don't talk about demons, except in some sort of metaphorical sense. And you could go on, right? Trauma instead of wounds, all of this therapy speak that is now ubiquitous, that even occurs to us to use more naturally than the more traditional and spiritual language of angels, demons, souls, consolation, desolation, all of this very rich vocabulary that some people still use, but everybody uses therapy speak, even if you don't totally want to. And so what we're dealing with here is a shift from one language set to another. And these two sets of terms, the therapy terms and the spiritual terms, are describing the same underlying experience, this emotional experience we have of the world, the response we have to the world, the way that we act on our emotions or fail to or try not to. And so we've got this one underlying reality that's being covered over by two different, overlapping, but distinct sets of words and terminologies and vocabularies, right? Two language sets covering the same situation. And so in some sense, even though both of these language sets exist in English, what we're dealing with here is a historical act of translation, a transition from the more spiritual way of talking about our experiences into the psychological and psychoanalytical way of talking about our experiences. And we can think about how to translate between these two ways that are almost like languages unto themselves, or little dialects within a language for talking about the same set of realities. And one of the things that I've been driving home about translation is something that the great Thomas Sowell, the economist, is often reminding us of, which is that everything in life involves trade-offs. There's no such thing as just keeping what you have and then adding on more stuff. You can only ever move from one set of things or ideas to another, or principles or practices or policies, and you get some things and you gain some things by that trade-off. It doesn't mean that it's always a wash or a net zero, that we gain just as much as we lose. In some cases, we want to make the trade-off because we don't value what we lose as much as what we gain. In other cases, we make bad trade-offs and we lose more than we gain. And economics is really just all about trade-offs. So is politics. And I've been arguing, so is translation. And so are languages. Different languages give you different things. They also obscure different things or deprive you of concepts for talking about different things. Doesn't mean that every language is created equal. Doesn't mean even that there might not be better languages for expressing certain things. Just that anytime you make a transition from one language set to another, or within a language from one vocabulary set to another, you are always making trade-offs. And in fact, I mentioned on another episode that Umberto Eco, the great medievalist, novelist, it's really a series of lectures, but he put it into a book on translation. And it's all about translation as negotiation, is what he calls it, between these two kind of alternative sets of ways for describing things. And the title of that book is Mouse or Rat, which is about one of the big problems in translation that he has encountered from Italian into English. And it gets at one of the weirdest things that happens when you learn another language and when you start translating, which is you begin to realize that distinctions and boundaries and concepts that you thought were hard-coded into the outside world, that didn't need any input from you to exist, are actually formed by your use of language to break up reality, whereas reality is actually this infinitely continuous spectrum that can be broken up in a bunch of different ways. And this sounds very technical and theoretical until you take it into the issue of mouse or rat. And what Eco points out is that this concept, this distinction we have in English between mouse and rat, cuts somewhere between a whole spectrum of rodents. And if you think about the features of a rat, you maybe think of it as bigger. You maybe think of it as having different, coarser hair. I'm sure there are scientific definitions of what a rat is versus what a mouse is, but that's not really what's operative when you decide which word to use. It's more about your experience of one group of mammals in this little spectrum, in the rodent spectrum, and another group of mammals. And in English, we have two buckets for putting the two sides of the spectrum into, but other languages have other buckets. And so something that looks like a rat to us might be a topo in Italian, but then something that looks like a mouse to us might also be a topo in Italian. And that this reflects a different way of experiencing the same underlying reality, which is a bunch of rodents. And not only does that change the language you use, it also changes the associations that you might draw between rat and other things that are like rats. So in English, we've gained a whole rich set of metaphors based on our perception of rats as distinct from our perception of mice, right? A mouse is someone timid, small, kind of maybe retiring and fearful, but not necessarily disgusting, whereas a rat is gross and maybe untrustworthy. And if you smell a rat, then you smell somebody that is going to betray you, right? So this whole architecture of association builds up on the basis of how you, as a thinking, rational being, take an underlying external world, which has a million infinite shades of gradation within it, and how you chunk it up based on your words. And when we change from soul speak into therapy speak, when we make the transition or the translation between these two ways of thinking about things, we are effectively doing the same thing. We're giving up one set of categories for chunking up the world and taking that same set of underlying emotional experiences, internal experiences of the world, and chunking them up with different categories, exchanging, trading depression for desolation, trading trauma for wounds, and all this stuff. And there are all sorts of times that we do this. It's not just in the case of transitioning from therapy speak into spiritual speak and vice versa. You might think also of colors, which are a great example because the light spectrum is infinitely divisible. It's a series, in science, it's accounted for with a series of wavelengths. And in our experience, we can chunk up this rainbow, essentially, spectrum of different colors in different ways. And there's a famous psychological thought experiment or philosophical thought experiment by this guy, Nelson Goodman, who talks about what if instead of the words blue and green, we had words like grew and bleen. And each of those words just took the band on the spectrum that kind of crosses over what we think of as the distinction between blue and green and chunks it out differently so that you have one color that's sort of in between blue and green, grew and bleen, and these other concepts. Would we see the world differently? Would I look at my wall, which I think of as blue, and my plants, which I think of as green, and find them to be different hues of the same color rather than different colors? And this way of thinking about things is a way of getting at how language shapes our experience and how even though the world outside is real and the underlying realities don't change just because we talk about them differently, the reality of our experience, which is the actual final reality that we encounter, might change and might be reflected in changes in language. And we don't have to stay in the hypothetical world of grew and bleen to talk about this. We can do what Umberto Eco does, which is look at passages from ancient literature where they talk about different colors in ways that suggest they think of certain things as the same color that we would think of as different. That maybe you talk about like a tawny yellow and a deep red, but the speaker of Latin might think of those as both the same color in different shades, whereas we would think of them as different colors. So this is the kind of transition that I'm talking about. All translation involves these transitions. Why does it matter? Well, when you make these transitions and you trade in one set of categories for another set of categories, you bring certain things into focus and you leave other things out of focus. So if I moved from Italian to English, I would bring into focus the distinction between the set of rodents we call mice and the set of rodents we call rats. And I would maybe blur distinctions, for example, between different kinds of relatives that have different names in Italian, but the same name in English. And all languages do this because since the spectrum of reality is infinite, you're necessarily going to be cutting it up in ways that show similarities between certain regions of the spectrum, but also obscure similarities between regions of the spectrum that are now bucketed into different words. There's no avoiding this. There's no language that is so perfect that it has a word for every infinitely small section of the spectrum. And so all you can do is try to cut more closely to the more significant distinctions for your experience and for the world as you encounter it most regularly. And this is why sometimes we just have to borrow words from other languages, right? German has all these great feeling words like Weltschmerz, this world weariness, that we feel like we have to grab and stick into English because in English we just don't have something that carves out quite that space on the emotional spectrum. Okay, take that idea and now apply it to the transition we made starting in the 1800s from talking in supernatural terms to talking in quasi-scientific terms about the experience of the soul. And, in some sense, this transition is part of a larger transition that predates the 1800s, and I described it in the previous episode as a shift away from supernatural ideas, supernatural causes of things, and toward internal natural causes. And both of those kinds of ideas, nature and supernature, were always present in Western thought throughout all of its history. But when we moved into psychology, it was like shifting the lens the focus on a camera lens, that suddenly supernatural things, which in our language had been really clearly described with simple words like demon and angel and God, leaving aside, right, what you believe about the underlying reality beneath those words, though we had really clear concepts for defining our experience of things that seemed to come from outside of nature into nature. We had less clear concepts for talking about things that we now know operate within nature, within this closed system of cause and effect that includes our family history, that includes our genetics, that includes our neurochemistry, that includes all this other stuff. And so we shifted this camera lens, as we were doing in every other realm of life, so that what was previously clear in the supernatural realm became blurry, and what was previously blurry in the natural realm became sharp and clear. I want to emphasize at this point that this really was a trade-off by which we gained some important things. It's very easy when you start talking about this, especially if you're a conservative like me who does want to emphasize the reality of the supernatural, to start fulminating and get very down on the transition toward attention to material causes and this natural logic of cause and effect. And I do believe, as I'm going to get into, that we have lost something dreadful by doing that to the exclusion of the other language set. We traded one language set for another, and we, in many ways, have really lost, I think, some good sense about the other realm of our experience, which is supernatural, which is above and outside of nature. But all of that having been said, we now know things about the natural system of cause and effect that operates, I would say, most of the time in our psychologies, which we didn't previously know. And we know stuff like you don't have to lock up a mad woman in the attic in order to cure her of her disease or hold her away from society. You can actually, in many cases, talk through her situation with her, or you can gradually aim for healing within her family system, or whatever else is going on. We've made advances by the development of psychology and psychotherapy and therapy speak, and anybody who tells you that we've not, that this has just been a pure loss and a decay and a decline, is politically motivated, is trying to sell you on some ideology rather than trying to describe the situation accurately. Because if we didn't gain anything, then it wouldn't have made any sense to make this transition. It was not simply a sinister plot by evildoers. It was an attempt to understand a part of the world that our language had hitherto left blurry, because all language sets leave some things blurry. All sets of vocabulary leave some things blurry. But, just like shifting the focus on a camera lens, when you focus in on this natural set of causes, you learn about things that are caused from within you, that you have a certain degree of control over, that are part of the natural world, and you lose the clarity of your concepts for talking about the external world and the world above and beyond. And so without words like demon and words like angel and words like God, even if we're not sure what we mean precisely by those words, we know that there's a set of experiences that is neatly captured by those linguistic buckets within those concepts. And we stopped being able to talk about those realities as real, so that we can only do what movies like Inside Out do, which is treat all of our experiences as natural parts of us that just need to be reintegrated into the system and perhaps healed or reoriented and aligned with our souls, but not ever expunged or bowed down to, or anything that you might do with something exterior to you over which you do not have full control, right? This idea that there might be something outside of you that is not part of you and that would be bad to integrate into you, but actually needs to be separated out and understood as another entity, that is really hard now to talk about, but we still might have those sorts of experiences. And unless you want to say that your impulse to murder at will is just a part of you that needs to be accepted and redirected, there may be some cases in which we would do better and be more actually compassionate to talk about this thing as an external force. Something like pathological anxiety, compulsive anxiety, might be better conceived of as something that's not actually part of us, that wasn't intended, implanted in us by design, but actually is from the outside. And this is what the terminology of demons helps us to do. It invites us to think about things that can have an effect on us, but are not natural, that is, that don't come up naturally from within us. And when For example, anxiety in the movie Inside Out takes control over Riley, the character. She loses a certain degree of control. And the question is whether in the kind of psychological model, which is also sort of the pagan philosophical model, she's able to reintegrate that into herself, or whether actually she's suffering under an attack of something external to herself. And so now, in those cases, which I want to again emphasize, may be the minority of cases, the vanishingly slim minority of cases. But if that happens, if we have that experience, are we up against something real that needs inclusion somehow or integration into our language for talking about the world? And so last time when I addressed this question, I talked about gravity. I asked, is gravity real in some sense? And if it's real, then we need a word for it, like gravity. And I argued that even though gravity is a set of relationships, not a thing in a body or an object, it nevertheless is real in some way. And that's why we have a word, gravity, for taking all of these disparate phenomena like apples falling to the ground and planets orbiting and all that stuff and bucketing them into one word. And that word is a neat little clear cookie cutter for picking out one particular region of the reality spectrum that we experience. And so gravity, if gravity is a useful word, maybe demon is a useful word. But there is something different about demons from gravity, right? Which is that gravity has these mathematical laws that obey cause and effect and can be tested in scientific ways. Demons, maybe not so much. They have more of the character of a consciousness, which is actually free. It's not our consciousness. It might enter us from outside and take over or have a will, let's say, in a mind of its own. It might cause us or influence us to do things, but not in the way that gravity causes us ineluctably to fall to the ground. So that's a difference, right? It doesn't actually have the power that a force of... demons don't have the same power as forces of nature, but they do have a certain... If they're real, they have a certain influence over us. And so now, instead of comparing demons to gravity, I want to compare demons to Santa Claus. And this may seem a bit perverse, but bear with me. So, okay, Santa Claus, right? Much like gravity, Santa Claus does not occupy a physical body, which makes it very difficult for the modern scientific mindset to conceive of him as real, in just the same way as Leibniz balked at Newton's idea of gravity. A modern scientist would balk at the idea of Santa Claus as real because, and this is true, there is no person who is Santa Claus in the sense of a human person, right? There is a person who is me. I occupy one region of space-time only at a time, not others. And I don't live forever, all of these things, right? That's all kind of, we can understand what we mean by a real person in a body. Santa Claus is not that sort of thing. And so the natural instinct, given our current language set, which is really only good at talking about bodies moving, the natural instinct is to consign him to mere suggestion, metaphor, association, unreality, essentially, to not include him in what I would call our ontological space, that is the set of things that are real. But think about it instead this way. Santa Claus is not in a body, so he doesn't share that with other real objects like chairs or me. But Santa Claus can meaningfully be said to have a character. And that character was generated over time by people thinking, right? In that sense, he's like an ens rationis, a being of thought. It was, at some point, through telling stories of a certain spirit in the world, inspired by the original St. Nicholas, although only distantly, that we came up with this character of Santa Claus as what you might think of as a fictional character. And yet, it's not so simple as simply saying that we created Santa Claus and did so through a sheer act of will. And that's because if you think about it, Santa Claus has certain things that he does and certain things that he doesn't do. And the type of spirit that we were trying to describe, which exists in human relations, the spirit of mirth, the spirit of generosity, the spirit of Christmas cheer, that spirit existed and we were trying to embody it in a fictional character. And so we wouldn't have been able, culturally, over time, to embody that in a character who, in his spare time, likes to torture puppies. And at this point, now that Santa Claus has taken on this trans-historical life of his own, even if everybody alive today made the decision that Santa Claus murders or tortures puppies in his spare time, you probably couldn't do that. It just wouldn't work. That wouldn't be Santa Claus. It would be against his nature. And so even if we all decided to, by a collective force of will, we could not make Santa Claus kill puppies or torture puppies. Now think about that for a second. Santa Claus resists our will, which means he's not purely a creation of our collective will. And so then you think, well, okay, what's the other thing about demons? Well, they can't make you do anything, but they can strongly influence you. In the traditional idea of a demon, right? A demon can strongly influence you to do something. Is this true of Santa Claus? Well, Santa Claus has never himself personally, let's say, for example, put a present under my tree. He doesn't have that kind of physical causative force, which again makes us tend to think of him as not real. And yet, even though Santa Claus can't pick up my shoes and move them to the other side of the room, there are many things that I, and probably you, have done in my life that I wouldn't have done if there were no Santa Claus. If there were no idea of Santa Claus, no story of Santa Claus, no character of Santa Claus, maybe I would still give people presents on Christmas, but I probably wouldn't put them under the tree. I probably wouldn't wrap them in quite the same way. I wouldn't write the same thing on the card, right? There are things that I have done explicitly because there is such a thing or such a concept as Santa Claus that I wouldn't have done if there were no such concept. And so it might, in fact, be meaningful in some sense to say that Santa Claus in my life has made me do things that I could have chosen not to do, but that I did because Santa Claus made me do them. Now take this and apply this to demons, right? Which also, in the traditional understanding, can't make things levitate, can't, pick up plants and smash them on the ground. I mean, this would be more like a poltergeist. And there are folktales about this sort of thing, but again, the more sophisticated ideas of demons have never included that sort of thing. They also can't make you do things, but they can, through the power of suggestion, through the nature of their character, through their operation within your mind, not as you, but as something that you in your mind play host to, they can influence and suggest and move and nudge you in various ways. So in the same way that gravity shares some features with demons, but is not a demon, and in the same, I would suggest that Santa Claus shares some features with demons, but is not a demon, and that demons might be real even though they are not embodied. There might be some meaningful way to speak of demons as having reality without talking about them as being embodied. And this is that space that I just carved out with a whole bunch of words and arguments and examples and ideas, which I needed to do because of our modern way of talking, right? That space that I just carved out in reality. That there are such things as, let's say, pathological anxiety, which might be outside, different from us, but operating within us, that prompt us to do things even though we have the choice not to, right? As I start to construct this linguistic portrait, I'm carving out a section of the reality spectrum that exists in our underlying experience that our current exclusively psychological language is incapable of accurately identifying as real. In the same way that before Newton, we didn't have the right bucket called gravity for putting all of these realities into, we might have a set of realities that we sometimes encounter, again, in the minority of cases, that needs to go in the demon-shaped bucket, even if we're very uncomfortable with the idea of demons as like little horned figures flying around, whatever, it doesn't matter. You need that demon-shaped bucket, and you need it because your language is your tool for organizing and ultimately affecting reality as we experience it. And psychologists of all people know this very, very well because they are our modern practitioners of the talking cure, which, as Donald Robertson, the scholar of Stoicism, points out, is an ancient concept that we would use words as a kind of cure. And one reason why that's true is because through words, we help to shape the way that we experience and chunk up reality and make ourselves and each other more or less effective at dealing with and encountering the experiences that we have. And if there is such a thing as something that can meaningfully be described as a demon or an angel, then calling it a demon and gathering it under one linguistic heading will make us more effective at dealing with it than if we try to refer to it as some oblique feature of our own nature. In other words, if you are suffering from spiritual attack or from demonic possession or whatever, you will be less effective if you talk to yourself as if you and your nature were the problem than if you talk to some sort of external entity that is bothering you, or talk to a priest about that external entity, or pray to God about that external entity, since God also is an external entity who alone is able to see reality without this mediation of language that we as language-using creatures have to use to mediate. And this brings me back to a point that I touched on last time, but didn't really drive home, I don't think, enough, which is that this shift in language from conceiving of demons as something inside of us or part of us to conceiving of demons as foreign entities that aren't supposed to be there is the primary way that Jesus himself in the Gospels frequently exiles demons, casts demons out of the individuals who harbor them. There's a number of places in the Gospels where the narrator will tell us about somebody who has a demon. And in English, it's not quite clear what that means, but in the Greek, it's very clear that this person is either en to pneumati akatharto, which means inside of an unclean spirit, or he is daimonis dominos, which is a participle meaning something like endemoned or demonized, but not in the sense of people think he's a demon, but rather that he's contained within this demon. So in other words, the man just is a subset of this spiritual entity called the demon. And daimonis dominos is what we translate with that word that I can never pronounce, which is demoniac or demoniac. But this just means that the narrator, the society, whatever, is describing these demon-possessed people as if the demonness is part of their nature, or even they are defined by the demonness of their nature. And what's the first thing that Jesus does when he encounters these people? One of the first things he says, the first language tool that he uses to cast demons out is, "Come out of him, you unclean spirit." And those words have that power to cast the demon out. Why is that? Well, I suspect that perhaps it's because the language tool of defining the man and defining the demon out of the man, cutting the demon out linguistically from the man, is itself a very powerful way of helping to linguistically nail down what is essentially real about you and what is external to you and needs to be cast out and denied. Casting things out, denying them, exiling them is not language that therapists tend to be comfortable with because it's associated with shame, it's associated with all these things that we're supposed to move past, and yet in some cases I would suggest there are some things that we simply do not want in our psychology. We don't want them to be part of us. And demonology, if it has any use at all, is useful and powerful as a way of talking about things, causes, and influences that might be outside of us, that don't depend entirely on our will, that aren't part of the definition of what we are and need to be related to as others and talked to and dealt with as others. All of this simply to say that the transition from soul language to psychology language isn't neutral because no translation is neutral and no change in vocabulary is neutral. It always represents chunking up reality in different ways, and it might be that just like that camera lens shifting its focus, just like those trade-offs that we make when we shift from one language to another, we gain the ability to capture some things really precisely, but we lose the ability to capture other things and deal with them effectively. And that's why I was very interested to learn from one listener who's just a wonderful correspondent, sends me all sorts of fascinating information. Peter Graziano sent me a message to the effect that when the Catholic Church employs exorcists, they work traditionally in tandem with a psychologist. So these two modes of understanding and these two language sets are kind of layered like a stereopticon onto each other, so that we deal with internal natural causes with the science of internal natural causes, and we deal with external realities in tandem with the science and understanding of external, highest, supernatural realities, which is religion or the spiritual mindset. I just find this very profound and fascinating, and it is further convincing me that although I have no authority or expertise on like what demons are in some absolute spiritual sense, we probably need to supplement our psychological language with a language of external spirits, gods, and certainly the spiritual and the supernatural world. We need the governing and guiding hand of religion in order to give us a fuller understanding than psychology alone can give. All right, that's the one more thing that I wanted to say about this whole topic. Let me know what you think. Very interested, again, to get in the conversation about this because it's something that I am puzzling out, but I just find it fascinating. I will see you next time for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.